Welcome back, everyone. Here's another very brief video. We're going back in time again. I want to make sure we're covering some things on Andrew Jackson, both his presidency and some things leading up to it as well, and certain characteristics that you'll see as his presidency as a big transition between the early republic and then some changes with our country. Of course, we'll go through more of this in detail in class, but I wanted to give you some of the basics plus some interesting stories you might find interesting. I'm also going to be reading some excerpts from Jackson's Way, Andrew Jackson and the People of the Western Waters by John Buchanan. I would say if you're going to try to detect the bias in this book, it's more pro-Jackson than anti-Jackson. But we're going to start off with his childhood. Andrew Jackson was the first president to be born of immigrant parents. His parents were Scotch-Irish. He was also the first president to not be born from either Massachusetts or, as you can imagine, Virginia. He was born in the Carolinas in 1767. He worked as a courier, basically like a messenger, as a child in the Revolution at only age 13. And when he was 13, he was captured by the British, suffered a head injury. So when we think of his role in the Revolution, there's some other firsts he has that makes him very transitional. He was the last president to serve in the Revolutionary War. He was the only president to have been a prisoner of war. He was the only president to serve in both the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. And he actually had some very traumatic events in the war, the death of his brothers, and things like that. So I'll read you just a small passage here. In common with many boys of a time and place, uh, by the war of the Revolution, 13-year-old Andrew Jackson rode with men who made war. He was not a combatant, but he was often so close to the action that danger lurked at every turn. He was given a pistol by William Richardson Davies and joined his band as a mounted orderly or messenger, for which I was well fitted, being a good rider and knowing all the roads. Davy was brave, elegant, refined, well educated, and a superb small unit combat commander, and by all accounts, he became Jackson's beau ideal as an officer. Given Davies' military accomplishments and the dashing figure he cut, the story is quite believable. So he was sort of like a mentor for what Jackson later became as an Army officer. But here's an interesting story. We mentioned he was a prisoner of war. They were taken in the house of their cousin, Lieutenant Thomas Crawford, and it was there that the famous incident took place. While the house was being ransacked, the British Dragoon commander ordered Andrew Jackson to clean his boots. The boy refused. The officer raised his saber and slashed at Andrew, who threw up his left hand in an attempt to protect his head. Years later, he wrote, "The sword point reached my head and has left a mark there as durable as the skull, as well as on the fingers." His brother Robert suffered a deep cut on the head when he refused a similar command and was immediately attacked by the officer. The boys were taken with other prisoners to Camden Jail and thrown in it with about 250 other prisoners. Jackson told James McLaughlin in 1843 that my brother, cousin, and myself, as soon as our relationship was known, were separated from each other. No attention whatsoever was paid to the wounds or the comfort of the prisoners, and the smallpox having broken out among them, for want of proper care, many men fell victim to it. I frequently heard them groaning in the agonies of death, and no regard was paid to them. And it mentions how his brother Robert died from it, while Andrew Jackson himself was very ill. So moving on to his young adulthood, coming from modest means, basically being self-taught, he did eventually end up studying law. And he became a colonel in the Tennessee militia. He represented Tennessee in both the House and the Senate. Now, the records show that he didn't really talk much on the floor of the Senate, but he did represent Tennessee there. A story many people are interested in is he did kill a man in a duel, a man who accused him of not paying gambling debts and also said some not so nice things about Andrew Jackson's wife. You can read all more about this. And he's also the only president to have killed a duel. The man's the only president to have actually murdered someone. Other presidents have killed people in war, but not really outside of that. I can read a little bit about that, about when it actually happened. So Dickinson fired first and basically yells, "Great God, I missed him?" Jackson took careful aim and squeezed the trigger. The hammer stopped at half cock. He pulled the trigger back to full cock, squeezed it, and fired. Dickinson staggered. His friends rushed to him and seated him carefully on the ground, his back resting against a bush. His pants were red. They removed his clothes and found the wound. The ball had struck him below the ribs, passed almost through his body, and lodged just under the skin above the opposite hip. Blood gushed from him. Thomas Overton walked over and looked at Dickinson, then went to Jackson and said, "He won't want anything more of you, General." Overton and the surgeon then escorted Jackson from the field, but they had gone only about 100 yards when the surgeon noticed that one of Jackson's shoes was filled with blood. "My God, General Jackson, are you hit?" "I believe that he has pinked me a little." Dickinson has more than pinked Jackson. His ball had struck home, breaking a rib or two, lodging near the heart and left lung, along with cloth and pieces of dirt. It would stay there for the rest of his life, giving Jackson extreme pain and causing occasional bouts of pulmonary hemorrhaging. Right? There's records of this, of him having dealing with that while in the White House. But Dickinson was not to know, Jackson ordered. Not even in his death agonies was he to be given the satisfaction of knowing that he had hit Jackson. Um, Dickinson was carried to a nearby house where he had stayed the night before and laid upon a mattress that quickly became sodden with his blood. His agony lasted the day and into the evening. He uttered horrible cries all that day. At 9 o'clock in the evening, he suddenly asked why they had put out the lights. 5 minutes later, he died, cursing Jackson's ball still inside him. His beautiful young wife, who had been called to his side, was too late and met on the road his party of gay young blades, now silent as they escorted a rough emigrant wagon that carried her handsome young husband's corpse. So crazy to think, right, that that man became president involved in this. Um, he was involved in another a fight where he was shot in his life, and later ended up becoming good friends with that person. We can talk about that story, and actually had a piece of jaw, no, a piece of bone in his shoulder, I think it was. I'll have to double check. That actually came out many years later when he was in the White House. Some other ways that he became famous, the duel wasn't what actually got him famous, is some of his military service. One is the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And here, not only was he successful in the battle, but he oversaw the destruction of 15% of the Creek population. So this is before the Trail of Tears. And then we also have the Battle of New Orleans, which we talked about already in the War of 1812, which was a huge victory over the British. Even though the war was technically already over, they didn't know the Treaty of Ghent was already signed, and really made him popular and well known throughout the United States. But that's not it for his military service. By 1817, President Monroe authorized him to lead an offensive against the Seminole and Creek Indians in Georgia and Florida. And this led to the First Seminole War. And looking back, many of these wars are looked at controversially, though at the time, many people thought it was sort of a necessity. For defending, not only for moving west, but for defending them. So here it says Jackson was criticized. So even then, Jackson was criticized for the Pensacola expedition then and since, on the grounds that he had invaded sovereign territory and that it was militarily unnecessary. Neither criticism stands up under scrutiny. Since Spain was helpless in enforcing its neutrality, Jackson was justified in driving out the British, and he was careful to claim precisely that, not conquest, at his purpose. Diplomacy aimed at getting Spain to do what it was incapable of doing was a fool's errand, and even if there had been hope of success, the problem could not wait for a slow grind of negotiations and proposals and counterproposals. So in other words, was he just sort of taking action, right, him and Monroe, because Britain and Spain weren't really getting it done? Was it, or was it just because, hey, we want this territory now ourselves? But along with that is the way he executed that. He did destroy Seminole settlements. He did capture a British fort. He did execute 2 British citizens. I have to check why they were ordered executed. So we can talk about that in class once I remember what that was. By 1819, the Spanish did cede all of Florida to the United States in the Adams-Onis Treaty, which is also known as the Transcontinental Treaty. He does run for president, right, with all this sort of popularity, and he runs against John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was an incumbent, and remember, incumbents usually have an advantage. And so JQA, John Quincy Adams, was the National Republicans. Jackson was the Democrats, or what became known as the time as the Jacksonian Democrats. It was the first truly national political campaign. Remember, we said that for most of the beginning of history in America, people didn't really campaign, especially for president. That was seen as not very gentlemanlike, right? Maybe people do their campaigns for you, they write letters, they write editorials in newspapers, but you don't go around being like, vote for me, right? You don't put your signs up everywhere. This started to change. And he really campaigned as a man of the people, right? I am from humble origins. I worked my way through up and through the military. And we need to fight against these elites who are making it hard for the common man, right? The bankers, right? The people with all the money, the people with all the power, right? So, John Quincy Adams, he obviously had a stronghold in New England, but Jackson did very well through much of the country, and he won. A big part of his campaign was also that he opposed the Bank of the U.S. He saw once again that that was something that was run by the elites. It was run by the powerful and the rich, and it was just to exploit the hard work of the working people of America. And he did what he needed to do to sort of get the bank to flounder. But unfortunately, what came along with all these actions was a recession hit in 1837, which ended up really hurting everyone, not just the elite, right? Old Hickory being his nickname back from the War of 1812. So you see a little bit of this here. And what he's probably most known for today, if you ask the average person, what do they think of Andrew Jackson? They'll probably tell you the Trail of Tears. As he appealed as a champion of the white settler against the interest of the Native Americans. So whether the white settler was trying to move west, whether he was just on the edges, the periphery of the border, what needed to be done to help them. So when he was office, there was a series of forced removal policies. Like, hey, you guys need to basically move west. Some did voluntarily, knowing like, what is the or else if we don't? Let's take advantage of what they might give us in return. But many didn't want to, right? Many were like, we're living here peacefully. If we're not attacking you, like, deal with the people who are attacking you, not us. Well, about 100,000 natives of various nations were relocated to lands west of the Mississippi River. Specifically, along the way, about 3,500 Creeks died from the hardships. All right, they were not giving a railway. Right, they were not traveling by rail here. This was a cumbersome march. And altogether, this wasn't something that just happened overnight or once. This was a series of removals that lasted basically until 1860. And we can share some more specific stories from that as well. Before we go, we can talk about, ways we still hear about him in the news today in class, about, the plan in the past to remove him from the $20 bill for some of these policies. About when the former President Trump gave Navajo code talkers an award in front of a portrait of Andrew Jackson, right? How that rubs some people the wrong way. But, how is he still remembered? Is he still the man of the common people, where they had literally had parties on the lawn of the White House, right? They tried to have the party in the White House. They moved the tub of alcohol outside to move the party outside. But I want to share also, I mentioned some of the transitions that he did. So you sort of see him from the early republic, right, as someone in the revolution, to the more industrial, expanded America. Um, so he was also, let me see, the only president, um, oh no, the first president to ride a train, right? So you see that of the Industrial Revolution. Um, he was the second president to be photographed. Um, Mm, the and while he was in the White House, he started things like having running water in the White House and installed the first indoor toilets in the White House. I do want to mention when we talk, so remember to bring this up, that he didn't have any children of his own. He did raise some children. His wife did raise um, a nephew of hers. They were twins, and there's mixed stories of why they raised one. So the one was Thomas Jefferson, was the first name, and I forget his last name, and the other one was Andrew Jackson Jr. Basically, he also took in an orphan who was a native. The name of the boy, I'll spell it, LynconyA. He was with a parent who was on the battlefield who was killed, and he raised him. Unfortunately, he did die of disease. Why did he not free any of his slaves? Right, these are all things that would be important for us to talk about. So, this wasn't very brief, but it was brief enough for a very complicated, um, famous and infamous president in our history. And I hope you want to learn more about him, and I want to talk more about him. All right, cheers, guys.